There was a night many years ago when I sat across from a man who had just lost everything. His fortune had collapsed in a single afternoon. His name, once respected in the banking halls of Chicago, had become a whisper of pity. His wife had left him. His health had failed. And yet, as he stirred the coffee between his trembling hands, he looked up at me and said something I have never forgotten. He said, "Mr. Hill, I believe this is the best thing that has ever happened to me." I studied his face for a long time that night. I was younger then, still searching for the hidden architecture behind success, still chasing the invisible threads that connected the great men I had interviewed. And in that moment, I realized I was sitting across from a truth that most of the world would spend a lifetime running away from. The seed of every great achievement, I came to understand, is planted in the soil of a setback so painful that the ordinary man would call it the end of his life. I spent more than 25 years studying the lives of 500 of the most accomplished men of my generation: Carnegie, Edison, Ford, Rockefeller, Firestone. I walked into their offices, their homes, their private moments, and when I asked them about the single experience that had shaped their greatness, not one of them pointed to their victories. Not one of them mentioned the fortune, the fame, the honors. Every single one of them, without exception, pointed to a moment of devastation, a bankruptcy, a betrayal, a crushing loss, a public humiliation, a death, a collapse so total that they could no longer recognize the man they had been before it. And each of them told me in his own words that this was the moment his real life began. But the most surprising part comes only now, because what I discovered was not that these men had merely survived their misfortunes. What I discovered was that they had used them. They had reached into the wreckage of their former lives and extracted from it a substance more valuable than gold. They had learned the secret law of the mind that Emerson wrote about in veiled language, the law that the Stoics practiced in silence, the law that Carnegie himself confessed to me one afternoon in his library when the sun was setting and the fire was low. Every adversity, he said, carries within it the seed of an equivalent or greater benefit, every single one, without exception. And the man who learns to find that seed, to water it, to protect it from the winds of self-pity and the frost of resentment, will accomplish things that the untouched man can never accomplish. I want you to consider this idea slowly, because it goes against everything modern culture has trained you to believe. You have been taught that adversity is something to be avoided, minimized, medicated, escaped. You have been taught that the good life is the life without struggle, without friction, without pain. And so when struggle comes, when pain comes, you treat it as an interruption. You treat it as a mistake. You treat it as evidence that something has gone wrong, that the universe has failed you, that you are being punished. But the men I studied did not see it this way. They saw adversity as an initiation. They saw it as the hand of infinite intelligence tapping them on the shoulder and saying, "It is time. It is time for you to become what you were meant to become. And the only way through this door is through the fire." Consider Thomas Edison, whom I came to know well in the final years of his life. He was not the man of polished legend that the school books now describe. As a boy, he was called stupid by his teacher. He was sent home with a note suggesting his mother not bother with his education. He lost most of his hearing after a train accident. His laboratory burned to the ground. He lost millions of dollars on experiments that led nowhere. He was mocked publicly for inventions that the experts of his day declared impossible. And when I asked him, sitting there in his workshop surrounded by the quiet hum of machines he had brought into the world, how he had endured it all, he looked at me with those pale, tired eyes and said something I have carried with me ever since. He said, "I have not failed 10,000 times. I have successfully found 10,000 ways that will not work." Do you understand what he was telling me? The ordinary mind sees 10,000 defeats. The extraordinary mind sees 10,000 refinements. Same events, same facts, different interpretation. And the interpretation is the entire difference between the life of a failure and the life of a legend. Here begins the darkest game of the subconscious mind, because most men, when adversity strikes, surrender the reins of their interpretation to the lowest part of themselves. They let fear narrate their experience. They let shame translate their loss. They let the wounded ego write the story of what has happened, and what the wounded ego writes is always a tragedy. The untrained mind, in the hour of adversity, becomes its own worst enemy. It broadcasts thoughts of defeat into the vast receiver of the subconscious, and the subconscious, being a faithful servant, begins to assemble the exact life that matches those thoughts. Not that the adversity destroyed these men. Adversity has never destroyed anyone, but that their reaction to the adversity destroyed them. And the reaction always was a failure of interpretation. The definite major purpose, which I have written about in many of my books, becomes most visible to a man not in the hour of ease, but in the hour of collapse. When everything a man has built is taken away from him, what remains is the core of who he truly is. His purpose, if it is real, does not vanish when the scaffolding falls. It stands there exposed, naked, undeniable, and in that terrible clarity, a man sees for the first time what he was truly made for. The man without a definite major purpose, when adversity strikes, has nothing to hold on to. He drifts. He collapses into his circumstances. But the man who has forged a definite major purpose in the quiet chamber of his soul feels something strange happen. He feels his purpose sharpen. He feels it come into focus. Adversity, you see, is the great revealer. It strips away the inherited, the borrowed, the performative. It leaves a man standing with only what is truly his, and what is truly his is the seed of his greatness. What Hill observed about this phenomenon is deeply unsettling. The men who rose to the highest altitudes of achievement did not merely tolerate their suffering. They developed over time a strange and almost mystical relationship with it. They began to trust it, not because they enjoyed pain, but because they had learned through repetition that every significant adversity in their lives had been followed by a significant expansion. Every loss had preceded a larger gain. Every public humiliation had preceded a private refinement. Every betrayal had revealed a truer path. And so, after enough cycles, they began to read the arrival of adversity as a signal that something great was on its way. The ordinary man reads adversity as a sign of ending. The extraordinary man reads adversity as a sign of beginning. And I tell you, with the full weight of my research behind me, this single shift in interpretation is the dividing line between the two lives you could live. I want to speak now of Henry Ford, because his story illuminates this principle with particular clarity. Ford was not a young man when he began to build the company that would bear his name. He had already failed twice. His first automobile company had collapsed. His second had been taken from him by his investors. He was nearly 40 years old, with two public failures behind him, and a reputation in Detroit as a man who could not be trusted with capital. Most men at 40, with two bankruptcies behind them, would have accepted the verdict of their circumstances. But Ford did something different. He sat down in the small workshop behind his house, and he used his failures as fuel. He studied them. He dissected them. He extracted from each one a specific lesson. And when he began his third company, the company that would eventually put the world on wheels, he carried with him the accumulated wisdom of two complete defeats. He did not succeed in spite of his failures. He succeeded because of them. The detail most people overlook is hidden right here. Ford's competitors, the men who laughed at him, had no such forging. They had succeeded too early, too easily, too unbroken. And when the real tests came, the tests of the market, the tests of the economic storms that swept through American industry, they had nothing to fall back on. They had no internal architecture of endurance. They had never learned what their own souls were made of. And so they broke. They broke while Ford stood, because Ford had already been broken. And the broken, rebuilt, refined man is the most dangerous competitor in any field of human endeavor. This is a law. This is not sentiment. This is a law of the mind and of the marketplace, and it has never once been broken in the history of human achievement. The mastermind principle, which I have taught for many decades, becomes particularly powerful when understood in the context of adversity, because a man in the hour of his collapse cannot rise by himself. He may have the will, he may have the vision, He may even have the definite major purpose burning in his chest. But the mind in adversity is a wounded instrument, and it cannot tune itself. It requires the harmonious alignment of other minds, carefully chosen, consciously gathered, to restore it to its full power. This is what Carnegie understood when he surrounded himself with the greatest minds of his era. This is what Ford understood when he cultivated the friendship of Edison and Firestone. No man rises alone. The rising requires the alignment, and the alignment is chosen deliberately in the hour after the fall. Here is a question I want you to consider. When the last great adversity struck your life, who did you turn to? Did you turn to a mastermind of carefully chosen, harmoniously aligned, purpose-driven minds? Or did you turn to the nearest available ear, the ear of someone who would validate your pain without challenging your interpretation of it? The ordinary response to adversity is to seek sympathy. The extraordinary response is to seek alignment. Sympathy soothes the wound. Alignment transmutes it. Sympathy keeps you where you are. Alignment carries you to where you must go. The wounded man needs more than comfort. He needs vision. And vision in the hour of adversity almost always comes from outside the self. Let us turn now to Abraham Lincoln, whose life is perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of the principle I am describing. Lincoln lost his mother when he was 9 years old. He lost his older sister when he was 19. He failed in business twice before the age of 30. He had a nervous breakdown at 27. He ran for state legislature and lost. He ran for Congress and lost. He ran for the Senate and lost. He ran for the vice presidency and lost. He ran for the Senate again and lost again. By any modern measure, Lincoln should have quit. He had every reason to quit, and yet he did not quit. He did not quit because somewhere deep inside him, beneath the accumulated weight of all those defeats, there was a definite major purpose that had never been defeated. His body was tired. His reputation was bruised. His bank account was empty, but his purpose was intact. And when the moment came, when the nation itself cried out for a leader who had been forged by every possible kind of loss, Lincoln was the only man in America who had been sufficiently prepared. The adversity had not been punishment. The adversity had been preparation. What the lives of great achievers have been trying to tell us for centuries is this: the universe does not hand greatness to the untested. It cannot. Greatness is not a gift, it is a capacity. And capacity is built only through resistance. Just as the muscle grows only when it pushes against the weight, just as the tree roots grow deep only when the winds have tested them, just as the blade is forged only by the hammer striking the hot steel again and again, so too the soul of a great achiever is built only by the repeated encounter with what seems to break it. If you have been spared adversity, you have also been spared greatness. The two are the same process. You cannot have one without the other. Modern man has lost the compass of his inner purpose, but not the need for it. He stands now in the most materially comfortable age that human history has ever known, and yet his soul is more anxious, more fragmented, more purposeless than any generation before him. Why? Because he has been protected from the very experiences that would have made him a man. He has been shielded from loss. He has been insulated from struggle. He has been told that pain is always a problem to be solved, that discomfort is always a signal to retreat. And so, when the inevitable adversities of life arrive, he has no interpretive framework for them. He cannot see them as initiations. He cannot see them as preparations. He sees them only as interruptions to the flat, painless, purposeless existence he has been taught to expect. And in that interpretive poverty, he collapses, not because the adversity was too great, but because his understanding was too small. The real turning point begins here, because the moment a man changes his interpretation of adversity, something extraordinary happens inside his subconscious mind. The entire internal apparatus shifts. The thought vibrations that were broadcasting defeat begin to broadcast expectation. The autosuggestion that was repeating the language of the victim begins to repeat the language of the builder. The subconscious, which is nothing more than a loyal mechanism that manifests the dominant thoughts of its owner, begins to assemble the life that corresponds to the new interpretation. And the man who once saw only walls begins to see doors. The man who once saw only endings begins to see thresholds. The man who once saw only loss begins to see the seed of the equivalent or greater benefit that Carnegie whispered to me about in his library so many years ago. This is not metaphysics. This is the most practical law of human experience that I have ever identified in my research. I want to speak now of a concept I have found to be the most transformative practice for the man walking through the valley of adversity. I call it transmutation. Transmutation is the alchemical act of taking the raw energy of a painful experience, the heat of it, the intensity of it, the emotional charge of it, and redirecting it into the service of your definite major purpose. Most men, when they suffer, allow the energy of the suffering to be wasted. They weep it out. They drink it away. They numb it. They let it leak from their system like heat from a broken furnace. But the great achiever does not waste this energy. He understands that suffering contains an enormous amount of psychic fuel, and that fuel, properly directed, can power an engine of creation, the likes of which the ordinary life has never seen. This is why you will find in the biographies of nearly every person who has done something monumental a period of intense personal adversity that immediately preceded their greatest creative output. The fire that would have destroyed them instead forged them. Here is the practice. Simple in description, but profound in application. When adversity strikes, do not ask, "Why is this happening to me?" This question is a doorway to self-pity, and self-pity is the coldest room in the house of the human soul. Instead, ask, "What is this preparing me for? What capacity is this adversity building in me that I did not possess before? What seed of equivalent or greater benefit is hidden in this experience, waiting for me to find it?" The questions you ask in the hour of adversity determine the answers your subconscious will deliver in the years that follow. Ask the victim's questions, and you will receive the victim's answers. Ask the builder's questions, and you will receive the builder's answers. The subconscious mind has no capacity to refuse a question asked in faith. The tragedy is that most men, in the hour of their greatest suffering, ask the most unworthy questions, and then live out the answers for the rest of their lives. The 6 ghosts of fear, which I have written about at length, all feed upon the misinterpretation of adversity. The fear of poverty grows when a financial loss is read as permanent rather than temporary. The fear of criticism grows when a public setback is read as final rather than formative. The fear of ill health grows when a bodily ailment is read as punishment rather than message. The fear of loss of love grows when a relational wound is read as betrayal rather than revelation. Each of these fears is not the result of the adversity itself. Each is the result of how the adversity is interpreted. And the interpretation can be changed. The interpretation must be changed, because as long as these fears occupy the subconscious mind, they will sabotage every attempt at greatness. They will whisper at every critical moment the language of retreat. There is a paradox at the heart of this teaching that I must speak of plainly. The paradox is that the man who most needs to hear this message is the man least likely to accept it, because the man in the middle of adversity does not want to be told that his suffering is a preparation. He wants to be told that his suffering is a punishment, because at least a punishment can be protested, can be argued against, can be blamed on someone or something outside himself. The interpretation of preparation places the responsibility back in his own hands, and this is precisely what he does not want in that moment. He wants to be a victim. He wants to be owed something. And until he releases this posture, until he stops demanding an apology from the cosmos and instead begins to ask what is being offered to him through this experience, he cannot move. He remains frozen in the moment of his wound, aging around it, organizing his whole life as a protest against what happened, when he could have been organizing his life as a response to what was being offered. But the most surprising part comes only now, and I say this with a gravity I hope you will feel. The adversities you are most ashamed of, the ones you never speak of, the ones you have hidden even from those closest to you, are almost always the adversities that contain the largest seeds. The public failures, the ones everyone knows about, are often the smaller gifts. The hidden failures, the private collapses, the shames you carry alone, these are the chambers in which your deepest gold is buried. I have seen this again and again in the men I studied. The thing they most wanted to erase from their history was almost always the thing that had shaped them most profoundly. The wound was the gift. The shame was the teacher. The failure was the foundation. And they had been running from the very thing that had been trying to lift them. The light in the struggle, then, is not a light that appears after the struggle has ended. It is a light that is present inside the struggle itself, radiating from within, waiting to be seen by the man who has the courage to look for it. Most men do not look. They close their eyes. They grit their teeth. They wait for the experience to end so they can return to the comfortable dark of their ordinary life. But the great achievers, the men and women who leave something behind them that outlasts their own mortality, they do not close their eyes. They look directly into the fire. They search for the shape of their own destiny within the flames. And what they find is a version of themselves they could not have met any other way. The adversity was not the obstacle to that meeting. The adversity was the appointment. And the man who keeps the appointment becomes the man he was meant to become. So I will leave you with a question. What is the adversity in your life right now? The one you have been treating as an enemy that might actually be an ally in a form you do not yet recognize? What seed of equivalent or greater benefit is hidden inside the experience you most wish had not happened to you? What capacity is being built in you right now that you will need in the version of your life that has not yet arrived? These questions, asked honestly, asked repeatedly, asked in the quiet hours when no one is watching, will begin to reorganize the architecture of your inner world. When was the last time you truly listened to what your adversity has been trying to tell you? Because it has been speaking. It has always been speaking. The only question is whether you have been willing to hear. The seed is already in the soil. The only question is whether you will do the work of the gardener or whether you will curse the storm that watered it.